Autumn 1941. Somewhere on the endless Russian steppe, a German chaplain sits in a frozen trench, hands trembling as he writes by candlelight. His diary entry will haunt history. Today I have buried a few more of my former parishioners who have died on this dreadful land. 3 more letters to write. The crossed-out names of the fallen now outnumber those of the living in my pocket diary. My parish bleeds out on the plains of this country. We will all die here. He was right. You think you know World War II. You've seen the films. D-Day, Pearl Harbor, the concentration camps, the triumph of good over evil, the greatest generation saving the world. But there was another war. A war so apocalyptic, so incomprehensibly brutal, that even the survivors couldn't speak of it. A war that Hollywood rarely touches. A war that history textbooks reduce to footnotes and casualty statistics too large for the human mind to process. The Eastern Front. Imagine sunflower fields stretching to the horizon, their golden beauty hiding the bodies of 100,000 men. Picture roads lined not with trees, but with frozen corpses, their faces locked in final screams, preserved by 40 degrees below zero cold. Envision cities where 2 million soldiers fought room by room, floor by floor, until the rubble itself ran red. This wasn't war as we understand it. This was the extinction of humanity on an industrial scale. 27 million Soviets dead. 4 million Germans never coming home. Battles where entire armies, 300,000 men, 500,000 men, simply vanished in weeks. Encirclements so vast they created pockets of hell on earth, where soldiers resorted to cannibalism just to survive one more frozen night. The Battle of Stalingrad alone killed more people than the United States lost in the entire war. And Stalingrad was just one battle. In one campaign. In a war that raged for 4 years across a front stretching from the Arctic Circle to the Black Sea. Your grandfather might have told you about the Pacific. Your history teachers showed you grainy footage of Normandy Beach. But nobody taught you about the day 3.8 million men crossed into the Soviet Union and ignited the deadliest conflict in human history. June 22, 1941. A Sunday morning. Clear skies. The smell of sunflowers in the air. And then, at exactly 3:15 a.m., the gates of hell opened. What happened next would change the world forever. And the men who marched into that vastness? Most of them had no idea they were already dead. But who are these men marching into that vastness? Not the generals whose names history remembers. Not the dictators who sent them. The ordinary soldiers who would bleed and freeze and die in their millions. On the German side, they were barely more than boys. Hans from Bavaria, 19 years old, who'd been working his father's farm 6 months earlier. Friedrich, a schoolteacher from Hamburg, who carried Goethe's poetry in his breast pocket. Klaus, a factory worker from the Ruhr, who'd never traveled more than 50 kilometers from home until the Wehrmacht drafted him. They'd been fed a steady diet of propaganda since childhood. The Slavs were Untermenschen, subhumans. The Bolsheviks were the Jewish conspiracy made flesh. Russia was a backward wasteland waiting to be civilized by German culture and German blood. One soldier wrote home in June 1941. "We're going to show these primitives what real soldiers look like. We'll be in Moscow by August, home for Christmas with medals on our chests." They had no idea what Russia actually was. The Soviet Union in 1941 was a complete mystery to the outside world. Since the revolution, it had sealed itself behind an iron curtain of secrecy. What little information escaped was contradictory, distorted, weaponized by both sides of the ideological divide. The Germans saw only what their propaganda wanted them to see. Bread lines, gulags, mass starvation, a nation held together by terror alone. They couldn't conceive of what they were actually facing. A landmass covering 1/6 of the Earth's surface. Forests so dense, so primeval, that entire divisions could advance only hundreds of meters before becoming hopelessly lost. Swamps in Belarus alone that equaled 2 entire German provinces. Rivers without bridges that flooded seasonally, transforming the landscape into an inland sea. The Pripyat marshes, where quicksand could swallow a tank whole. The endless steppe, where a man could walk for days without seeing a tree, a hill, anything to break the crushing monotony of infinite grassland. And the Soviet soldiers? They were just as human, just as trapped. Nikolai from Ukraine, whose village priest had been shot 3 years earlier for hiding grain. Sergei from Georgia, who'd watched his father disappear in Stalin's purges. Ivan from Siberia, who wrote to his mother, "I dream of becoming a sniper, of killing fascists as quickly as possible, so we can return to live happily and see our dear families again." Here's the tragedy that no propaganda could hide. Neither side's ordinary soldiers chose this war. They were fed to twin machines of annihilation. Hitler's racial empire demanding Lebensraum, living space, carved from Slavic flesh. Stalin's paranoid dictatorship that had already murdered millions of its own citizens, and would sacrifice millions more to survive. A German corporal would later write about those early days with bewilderment. "The villagers threw flowers on our tanks. Old women blessed us with Orthodox crosses. They called us liberators. But the Red Army fought to the last bullet. How could both things be true? Because both peoples were prisoners of systems that transformed human beings into ammunition. In a few hours, these farmers and teachers and workers would cross into a land that would swallow entire army groups whole. A land where winter temperatures dropped to -50. Where the mud season could immobilize 1 million men. Where the distance between victory and death could be measured in frozen tears. They thought they were soldiers beginning a campaign. They were actually dead men walking into their own graves. They just didn't know it yet. June 22, 1941. 3:15 in the morning. The Soviet border guards were playing cards, smoking cigarettes, talking about their girlfriends back home. They had 4 minutes left to live. Then 7,000 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously. The largest bombardment in human history turned the dawn sky orange. The ground shook like an earthquake. Birds fell dead from the sky. Their tiny hearts burst from the percussion. In that first hour, 1,200 Soviet aircraft were destroyed, most of them on the ground, their pilots running toward planes that exploded before they could reach them. Operation Barbarossa had begun. 3.8 million Axis troops surged across a front stretching 2,000 kilometers. Behind them rolled 600,000 vehicles, 750,000 horses, 3,000 tanks. Above them, the Luftwaffe Stukas screamed down like mechanical vultures. The dust clouds from this invasion force could be seen from space. Franz Halder, chief of the German General Staff, wrote in his diary, "The campaign against Russia will be won in a couple of weeks." He wasn't alone in this delusion. The Wehrmacht had crushed Poland in 35 days. France, mighty France with its Maginot Line, had fallen in 6 weeks. Norway, Denmark, Belgium, Holland, Yugoslavia, Greece. Every nation that stood against the German war machine had crumbled like sandcastles before a tide. Why should Russia be different? Especially Russia, this backward nation of peasants and commissars. Stalin had received 84 separate warnings about the German buildup. British intelligence, Soviet spies, his own generals begging him to mobilize. He ignored them all. Worse, he threatened to shoot anyone who suggested the Germans might attack. On June 21st, German deserters swam across the Bug River to warn Soviet sentries that the invasion would begin at dawn. Stalin ordered the deserters shot as provocateurs. The result was catastrophe. Soviet troops were caught in their barracks, some literally in their underwear. Entire divisions evaporated in the first hours. By noon, The Germans had advanced 30 kilometers. By nightfall 50, the blitzkrieg was working perfectly. Lightning war, as advertised. The Wehrmacht moved through western Russia like a scythe through wheat. In 3 weeks, they captured Minsk, the capital of Belarus. 300,000 Soviet soldiers surrendered. In 6 weeks, they took Smolensk, the ancient fortress city that guarded the road to Moscow. Another 300,000 prisoners. German soldiers rode home in amazement. The enemy was collapsing faster than they could advance. The Luftwaffe owned the skies. The panzers were unstoppable. Villages welcomed them with bread and salt, the traditional greeting for honored guests. Ukrainian women held up their babies to be blessed. Lithuanian partisans who'd been fighting Soviet occupation joined the German columns. In some towns, Stalin's portrait was torn down and burned in the streets before the Germans even arrived. "We can already see the Kremlin towers through our binoculars," exclaimed an officer of the 2nd Panzer Group. They were 350 kilometers from Moscow. At this rate, they'd be there in 2 weeks. The war would be over before autumn. Everything was going according to plan. Better than planned. The Soviet Union was dying, bleeding out through 1,000 wounds. Victory felt not just possible but inevitable. Mathematical. Preordained. But then something strange happened. Something the Germans hadn't calculated in their perfect equations of conquest. The sky darkened. The temperature began to drop. And in the distance, barely audible over the rumble of tank engines and marching boots, came a sound that would haunt German soldiers for the rest of their lives. The sound of rain. Russian rain. The kind that turns earth into an ocean of mud. The rain came first. Then the mud. The Russians called it Rasputitsa, the season of no roads. Within days, the mighty Wehrmacht, the force that had conquered half of Europe, was drowning in an ocean of brown sludge. Tanks that had rolled through Paris boulevards now sank up to their turrets. Horses, yes, the modern, German army still relied on 750,000 horses, drowned in the liquid earth, their screams echoing across the steppe. Trucks disappeared entirely, swallowed like sacrifices to an ancient god. Supply lines stretched, snapped, dissolved. Men marched for 16 hours through knee-deep mud just to advance 5 kilometers. But this was only nature's warning shot. The real shock came from something the German High Command hadn't calculated in their perfect plans. Soviet soldiers, who refused to surrender even when surrounded, outnumbered, hopeless. At Kiev in September, the Wehrmacht achieved the largest encirclement in military history. 665,000 Soviet soldiers captured. An entire army group erased. Hitler called it the greatest victory ever achieved. His generals weren't celebrating. They were doing the math. 600,000 prisoners meant millions more still fighting. Kill one Red Army soldier, 2 more appeared. Destroy a division, 3 more materialized from the endless depths of Russia. A German officer wrote in his diary, "We were told they were subhuman. But subhumans don't fight like this. At Brest Fortress, we surrounded 4,000 men. They held out for a month without water, without food, without hope. When we finally took it, we found inscriptions carved into the walls. I am dying, but I will not surrender. Farewell, motherland." This was the illusion shattering. The contradiction that broke German minds. In the same villages where civilians blessed them with crosses and offered bread and salt, partisans emerged from the forests at night. The grandmother who smiled in daylight planted mines in darkness. The boy who helped water German horses guided Soviet paratroopers to ammunition dumps. By October, snow began to fall. Not the gentle snowflakes of German Christmas cards. Russian snow. Horizontal. Blinding. Temperatures plummeted to -20, -30. German summer uniforms, because the High Command had promised victory before winter, offered as much protection as tissue paper. Soldiers wrapped themselves in tablecloths stolen from peasant homes. They stuffed newspapers into their boots. They burned their own vehicles for warmth. Weapons wouldn't fire, the oil froze. Tank engines had to run continuously, or they'd never start again. Frostbite took more casualties than Soviet bullets. Men would remove their boots to find toes that snapped off like brittle twigs. Faces turned black. Limbs required amputation with hacksaws because surgical equipment had frozen solid. A soldier named Wilhelm wrote to his wife, "The East is beginning to show its true face. We thought we were warriors. We're just men dying in a white desert. Russia is swallowing us whole." Moscow glimmered just 30 kilometers away. So close that forward units could see the sun reflecting off the Kremlin's golden domes. So close they could pick up Moscow radio broadcasts. So close, yet impossibly distant. Because between them and victory stood fresh Siberian divisions, transferred from the Far East, equipped for winter war, fighting for their capital, their families, their existence. And behind German lines, Stalin issued Order 227. 3 words that would echo through history. Not one step back. The trap was closing. The hunters had become the hunted. Winter was here. Real Russian winter. The kind that had destroyed Napoleon. The thermometer read -40 degrees Celsius. And it was still falling. In August 1941, inside Hitler's Wolf's Lair headquarters in East Prussia, a war was raging. Not against the Soviets, against reality itself. The generals wanted Moscow. Take the capital, they argued, and the Soviet Union collapses. It's what Napoleon should have done. It's what wins wars. You cut off the head, the body dies. General Halder slammed his fist on the map table. Moscow is the nerve center. The railway hub? The symbol. Every day we delay gives Stalin more time to fortify. Hitler's eyes turned cold. You think like accountants, not visionaries. Moscow is just buildings. Ukraine is bread. The Caucasus is oil. Leningrad is where Bolshevism was born. It must be erased from the earth. This wasn't military strategy. This was ideology masquerading as tactics. Hitler's Lebensraum fantasy demanded farmland for German settlers. His racial doctrine demanded the starvation of Slavic cities. His ego demanded multiple victories simultaneously. So instead of concentrating force like a spear thrust, he spread it like butter across bread. Army Group North to Leningrad. Army Group South to Ukraine. Army Group Center to waste precious weeks while summer bled into autumn. Field Marshal von Rundstedt would later call it the fatal decision. The moment hubris murdered logic. Meanwhile, on the actual front, German soldiers were having their own desperate debate with the reality they'd been promised versus the nightmare they were living. They'd been told they were fighting subhuman communist slaves. Instead, they faced an enemy who turned every building into a fortress, every forest into a killing ground. A Wehrmacht corporal wrote home. They told us one German soldier was worth 10 Russians. Maybe that's true. But what happens when the 11th Russian appears? And the 12th? And the 100th? Rations were cut in half by September. Then cut again. The supply lines, stretched across 2,000 kilometers of partisan-infested territory, couldn't feed 3 million men. Soldiers began eating their horses. Then dogs. Then leather boots boiled into soup. One division reported its men were reduced to little more than their shirts and weapons. The vehicles told their own story of collapse. Of 600,000 that crossed into Russia, half were dead by October. Not destroyed by enemy fire, murdered by dust, mud, cold, and distances that seemed to expand like a curse. Tank crews had to light fires under their engines each morning just to thaw the oil. When they ran out of fuel, they abandoned machines worth more than a German worker's lifetime earnings. In September came the triumph of Kiev, 665,000 prisoners. Hitler called it the greatest battle in history. But every soldier could do the math. If we're capturing this many, and they're still fighting, how many are there? The answer was terrifying. Stalin had mobilized another 5 million. And another 5 million behind them. And the entire nation behind that. The brutality escalated like a spiral into hell. Hitler's Commissar order demanded the execution of all captured Soviet political officers. The Einsatzgruppen mobile killing units followed the army, murdering Jews and communist officials. Partisan attacks increased. German reprisals grew more savage. Villages burned. Civilians hung from telephone poles. What had begun as a war became an extermination. A German lieutenant wrote in his diary, "We came as soldiers. We've become something else. I don't know what to call it. I only know I don't recognize myself anymore." October 2nd, 1941. Hitler finally unleashed Operation Typhoon, the assault on Moscow. 2 million men, 78 divisions, the largest concentration of force in human history. The final throw of the dice. Chief of Staff Halder wrote, "Now we will break the back of the Red Army." But the Red Army's back was made of something the Germans hadn't calculated. Not steel or strategy. Something simpler and more terrible. The willingness to die where they stood. Winter was coming. Real winter. The kind that would turn German confidence into frozen corpses. The thermometer at the front read -15. Moscow was just 30 kilometers away. But those 30 kilometers might as well have been 30,000. Because something was approaching from Siberia. Fresh divisions. Dressed in white. Ready for war at 50 below zero. December 5th, 1941. Temperature, -35 degrees Celsius. German soldiers could see the spires of the Kremlin through their binoculars. They were 30 kilometers from Moscow. 30 kilometers from victory. 30 kilometers from ending this nightmare. They would never get 1 meter closer. At dawn, something impossible happened. The defeated Red Army attacked. Not a probe. Not a raid. A full-scale offensive across a 1,000-kilometer front. Fresh Siberian divisions, transferred from the Far East after Soviet intelligence confirmed Japan would strike south, not north. Men dressed in white camouflage, invisible against the snow. Men whose weapons worked at 50 below because they were designed for it. Men who'd been training in conditions that killed Germans just by existing in them. The German soldier who'd written about seeing the Kremlin towers would freeze to death 3 days later, his final diary entry reading, "We are no longer an army. We are ghosts being hunted by winter itself." But winter was just nature's contribution to the Soviet revenge. The real counterattack was human, methodical, merciless, and it exposed a truth the German High Command had refused to accept. They had never understood what they were fighting. A Wehrmacht officer named Kurt Meyer watched his entire battalion dissolve in minutes. Soviet artillery. Stalin's organs. The terrifying Katyusha rocket launchers turned his positions into a moonscape. Then came the tanks, T-34s that German anti-tank guns couldn't penetrate. Then the infantry screaming, "Ura!" as they charged through temperatures that turned breath into ice crystals. Meyer later wrote, "We thought we were warriors. We were children playing at war against men who had nothing left to lose." The numbers tell one story. 100,000 German frostbite casualties by December. Entire divisions with more men in field hospitals than holding rifles. Panzer units reduced to a handful of functioning tanks. But the human reality tells another. Soldiers were found frozen in their foxholes, standing upright, rifles still aimed, transformed into ice sculptures. Others huddled around the burning remains of their own vehicles, trading irreplaceable equipment for minutes of warmth. One soldier's letter, found on his frozen corpse. "Mother, my feet turned black yesterday. The medical officer says there's nothing he can do. No morphine left. I'm using my last strength to write this. Tell father I tried to be brave. The Russians are coming. I can hear their tanks. It sounds like thunder that never stops. Hitler's response to reports of retreat? No withdrawal. The German soldier is to stand and die where he is. Commanders who pulled their men back to save them from annihilation were court-martialed. Some were shot. The Führer, warm in his headquarters, demanded that freezing men with no ammunition, no food, no winter clothing, somehow stop an enemy that now outnumbered them with weapons that actually functioned. But Stalingrad would be the true mic drop moment. The battle that began in August 1942 as another German thrust for glory became a meat grinder that devoured the myth of German invincibility. Hitler wanted the city because it bore Stalin's name. Stalin wanted it held because it bore his name. Between these two egos, 300,000 German soldiers and 500,000 Soviets would die. The battle descended into something medieval. Fighting room by room, floor by floor, sometimes taking days to capture a single building. German soldiers called it Rattenkrieg, the War of the Rats. A sniper's paradise where life expectancy was measured in hours. Then came November 22nd, 1942. Operation Uranus. The Soviets didn't attack Stalingrad itself. They attacked the flanks, held by Romanian and Italian troops, allies Hitler had dragged into his racial war. These units, poorly equipped and worse led, shattered like glass. Within 4 days, the entire German 6th Army, 300,000 men, was trapped in a pocket 40 miles wide. General Paulus, commanding the 6th Army, radioed for permission to break out while there was still a chance. Hitler's response: "The 6th Army will hold its position. I will not allow retreat." Göring promised to supply the trapped army by air. They needed 700 tons of supplies daily. The Luftwaffe managed to deliver 90. Sometimes less. Sometimes nothing. What followed was slow-motion annihilation. December in Stalingrad. January. Men eating horses. Then dogs. Then leather. Then rumors of worse, whispered but never confirmed. The wounded lay in cellars, untreated, their screams echoing through the ruins. Frostbite took more casualties than Soviet bullets. Dysentery ravaged men already skeletal from starvation. A lieutenant wrote in his diary, "We are no longer human beings. I don't know what we are. The dead are lucky. They no longer have to see what we've become." January 31st, 1943. Field Marshal Paulus, Hitler had promoted him, hoping he'd choose suicide over surrender, radioed his final message. 6th Army faithful to their oath to the last breath. Then he surrendered. Of the 91,000 Germans who stumbled into Soviet captivity, only 5,000 would ever see Germany again. The last German radio transmission from Stalingrad. Temperature minus 31 degrees. Fog and red haze over Stalingrad. Weather station closing. Greetings to the homeland. Then silence. The math was simple now. The Wehrmacht had lost an entire army. 22 divisions. The equivalent of all German forces in Western Europe. But more than men and material died at Stalingrad. The myth died. The inevitability died. For the first time since 1939, Nazi Germany had suffered a defeat so complete, so public, so undeniable that even Goebbels' propaganda couldn't spin it as anything but catastrophe. In Berlin, they declared 3 days of mourning. In Moscow, for the first time since the invasion, church bells rang in celebration. The god of war had changed sides. The news from Stalingrad hit the German home front like a sledgehammer to glass. For the first time in the war, Goebbels couldn't spin defeat into victory. 3 days of national mourning. Flags at half-mast. Radio stations playing funeral dirges. The myth of the invincible Wehrmacht lay buried under Russian snow alongside 300,000 German soldiers. But the real shockwave was psychological. A secretary in Berlin wrote in her diary, "If an entire army can simply vanish, what else have they been lying to us about?" That question spread like wildfire through a nation that had been drunk on victory for 3 years. Mothers who'd sent their sons east with pride now wondered if they'd ever see them again. The answer for millions would be no. Germany's allies reacted like rats sensing a sinking ship. Mussolini, who'd sent his best divisions to die in Russian snow, began secret peace feelers to the Allies. Hungarian diplomats quietly explored switching sides. Romanian officials started calculating how quickly they could abandon Hitler when the moment came. The coalition of fascist Europe was cracking, and Stalingrad was the hammer blow that started the fracture. In Moscow, Stalin addressed the nation for the first time since the invasion. "The German army is not invincible," he declared. "It can be beaten. It has been beaten. It will be beaten again." Church bells that had been silent since the revolution rang across the Soviet Union. In factories from the Urals to Siberia, workers who'd been building tanks 16 hours a day wept with relief. The tide had turned. Churchill, receiving the news in London, allegedly drank an entire bottle of champagne and declared, "This is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end. But it is, perhaps, the end of the beginning." American newspapers, which had barely covered the Eastern Front, suddenly realized that the real war, the war that would decide everything, was being fought in places they couldn't pronounce. What followed from 1943 to 1945 was not war, but methodical annihilation. The Wehrmacht, bled white at Stalingrad, could never again mount a strategic offensive. Operation Citadel at Kursk, July 1943, the largest tank battle in history, was Germany's last desperate attempt to regain the initiative. 3,000 German tanks against 5,000 Soviet. The cream of the Wehrmacht's panzer forces, including the new Tiger and Panther tanks, thrown into a battle Hitler called decisive for the war. It lasted 12 days. When the smoke cleared, the German panzer force that had once conquered Europe was effectively destroyed. A German tank commander wrote, "We attacked with 2,000 tanks. We retreated with 200. The rest are burning across the steppes, monuments to our leader's madness." From Kursk onward, it was retreat. Always retreat. Fighting withdrawals that turned into routs. Defensive lines that crumbled before Soviet offensives that grew larger, more sophisticated, more merciless. The Red Army of 1944 was not the disorganized force of 1941. It had learned, adapted, evolved into the most powerful military machine on Earth. And it wanted revenge. By January 1945, the Soviets launched the Vistula-Oder offensive. In 3 weeks, they advanced 300 miles. 3 weeks to cover what had taken the Wehrmacht 6 months in 1941. The mathematics of collapse were inexorable. Where Germany could replace one lost division, the Soviets fielded 10 fresh ones. Where the Luftwaffe could muster 100 planes, the Red Air Force launched thousands. The human cost staggers the mind. 27 million Soviet dead. 13 to 14 million of them civilians. Entire cities erased. Leningrad, besieged for 872 days, lost 1 million people to starvation and disease. In Belarus, 1 in 4 people died. In Ukraine, villages that had existed for centuries simply ceased to be, their populations murdered, their buildings burned, their very names forgotten. On the German side, 4 to 5 million military dead on the Eastern Front alone. 80% of all Wehrmacht casualties occurred in the East. Entire generations of German men vanished into the snow and mud and flames. By 1945, the Wehrmacht was drafting children and grandfathers, sending them to die with weapons they barely knew how to use. A Soviet general, surveying the ruins of Berlin in May 1945, said, "If the war in the West was hard, the The war in the East was the end of the world. He was right. Two totalitarian systems had fed their peoples into a meat grinder of unprecedented scale. Two ideologies that promised paradise had created hell on earth. And when it ended, when the guns finally fell silent, half of Europe lay in ruins, and the other half lay in chains. The Cold War had begun before the ashes of the hot war had even cooled. Today, if you walk the fields of Eastern Europe, you'd never know that 30 million people died there. The sunflowers grow tall again. The wheat waves golden in the summer breeze. Nature healed itself, as nature always does. But beneath that peaceful surface lies an erasure so complete, so deliberate, it speaks louder than any monument ever could. After the war, the Soviet Union made a decision. Every German military cemetery on Soviet soil was destroyed. Not just abandoned, obliterated. Crosses ripped from the earth. Gravestones sledgehammered into dust. Names erased. Graves plowed under. The land was replanted with forests, turned into collective farms, paved over for highways. 3 million German soldiers disappeared not just from life, but from memory itself. As if they had never existed. As if their mothers had never kissed them goodbye. The message was crystal clear. Invaders deserve no memory, no mercy, no marker to show they ever walked this earth. Meanwhile, across the Soviet Union, monuments rose like accusations against the sky. Towering statues of Soviet soldiers, their stone eyes forever gazing west, toward the enemy that had come and been destroyed. T-34 tanks on pedestals in every liberated city. Eternal flames that still burn today, tended by school children who weren't born until decades after the war. The victors wrote history not just in books, but in bronze and granite and sacred fire. In Germany, veteran associations still publish lists. Page after page of names. The missing. The unaccounted. Hundreds of thousands of men who marched east and simply vanished. Swallowed by snow, mud, flames, or Soviet camps. Families that even today, 80 years later, wonder if somehow, somewhere, their grandfather might still be alive. Old women who still keep a candle in the window. Just in case. The German chaplain who wrote that his parish was bleeding out on the Russian plains? He was right. His entire village's generation of young men died in the East. Not one returned. The church where he baptized them as infants stands empty now, a monument to absence. But here's what we must understand, what we must never forget: this wasn't heroism. This wasn't glory. This was the complete failure of civilization. Two totalitarian ideologies turned human beings into ammunition and fired them at each other until the barrels melted. Hitler's racial empire demanding Lebensraum carved from Slavic flesh. Stalin's paranoid tyranny that had already murdered millions of its own people and would sacrifice millions more to survive. The ordinary soldiers, German and Soviet alike, were both perpetrators and victims. They committed atrocities. They suffered atrocities. They were fed into a machine that stripped them of humanity and turned them into instruments of annihilation. A German soldier could hand out chocolate to Russian children in the morning and burn their village that night. A Soviet soldier could liberate a concentration camp and then commit rape on a massive scale. The war didn't create heroes and villains. It created survivors and corpses. What's the lesson? It's not that war is hell. Every generation learns that and forgets it just as quickly. The lesson is more specific and more terrifying. When ideology replaces humanity, when the state becomes God, when hatred becomes policy, when we stop seeing others as human beings with mothers who love them, that's when we create Eastern fronts. That's when we turn young men into frozen corpses standing upright in trenches. That's when we make mothers count their dead sons instead of their grandchildren. The numbers are too large for the human mind to grasp. 27 million Soviets. 4 million Germans. Each one was someone's everything. Each one had a name, a favorite song, a fear of the dark, a girl they wanted to marry. Each one died terrified and alone, thousands of miles from home, for the ambitions of dictators who never heard their screams. Right now, today, there are leaders who look at maps and see territory, not people. Who speak of destiny and greatness and historical necessity. Who would feed another generation into another meat grinder for another ideology. The Eastern Front isn't ancient history. It's a warning written in blood across half a continent. This is what happens when we forget that every uniform contains a human being. Every statistic was someone's child. Never again? That's not a promise. It's a choice we have to make every single day. You came here thinking you knew World War II. Now you know the war that history tried to bury under sunflower fields and Soviet monuments. 30 million dead. An entire generation erased. All for the ambitions of two madmen who never heard a single scream from the frozen trenches. This is what happens when we see borders instead of families. Maps instead of mothers. Statistics instead of sons who'll never come home. The Eastern Front isn't some distant historical curiosity. It's a warning carved in blood across half a continent. And here's the terrifying part. It could happen again. Right now, there are leaders who speak of destiny and greatness and historical necessity. Who would feed another generation into another meat grinder if it serves their ideology. So here's my question for you. What do we owe the 30 million who died in that frozen hell? What do we owe the German teenager who froze to death 30 kilometers from Moscow? What do we owe the Soviet boy who wrote to his mother about killing fascists so he could come home and never did? We owe them memory. We owe them the truth. We owe them the promise that we'll never let it happen again. Drop your answer in the comments. Tell me, what's the lesson you're taking from this? Because if even one person watches this and decides that human beings matter more than flags and borders and ideological fantasies, then maybe those 30 million didn't die for nothing. If this story shook you, if it taught you something they never covered in school, hit that like button. Share it. Make sure this history doesn't disappear the way those German graves did. Subscribe for more stories they don't want you to know. Next time, we're going deeper into the darkness. And remember, every statistic was a name. Every number was someone's everything. The chaplain's diary. The crossed out names. His parish bled out on the plains of Russia. Make sure yours doesn't.